Let's go ahead and get started. Perfect. All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Floating Kelp Canopy Indicator Workshop number 2. We are very glad to have you all here today. My name is Elizabeth Spalding, and I am with the Habitat Strategic Initiative, and I will be serving as your MC today as we move through our presentations. First thing I wanted to do is just let you all know that we are recording this and that this recording will be made available after the meeting today. So feel free to return back to it or even share it with friends. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to view this and hear the presentations. The second thing I wanted to mention is that we are going to be using a variety of tools today to get your feedback. And we do have a very packed agenda. So I want to point you toward the chat and the polling features that we are going to use today. And in a moment, we'll have an opportunity to practice the polling features. But we do really want to get your questions, your comments, good discussion going as much as we can during our presentations in the chat. And then we will also have opportunity for face-to-face discussion. So next slide. So just to give you a quick overview of where we're headed in the next 2 hours, what we would like to do is give an overview of our proposed indicator. So we have members from our project team who are going to discuss with you what the general indicator is at this point. And then we're going to move into a discussion where we really look at the prototype and discuss the various aspects and considerations that were taken in the development of this proposed indicator. And so throughout these presentations, we have a few polling questions that we are going to offer. What we're looking for is initial impressions. We really want to get your thoughts on where are we at with each of these components. So we're going to ask an initial set of questions throughout the presentations, and we will revisit those questions at the end of the workshop today to see if your impressions have changed after we've had some opportunity to discuss. After our presentations, we are then going to move into breakout groups, and you will be randomly assigned to small groups. Each group is going to have a facilitator and a note taker, and the goal of those discussions is to answer questions and get your feedback on additional considerations and components of that indicator. And then we'll come back together, have that second poll, discuss next steps, and send you on your way. So we do have quite a bit to cover today. One thing I wanted to really reiterate is that this is just the beginning of the conversation for this aspect of the phase of the indicator development. So we do want to have the opportunity for additional conversations. So if you don't feel like you've had everything answered today, know that we are willing and able to have additional conversations to continue this discussion. And so I am going to do a quick poll test so that everyone is oriented to the polling feature. Next slide, please. So hopefully you all should have a test question pop up in front of you. And the question is, how do you want to use the floating kelp indicator? So feel free to quickly just tag those ways that you would like to use the indicator. We're going to give you just a few seconds, so you've got to be quick on your feet when we do these polling questions. I'm going to see how many people are, okay, you guys are on it. This is excellent. Okay, we are almost there. Okay, I'm going to end poll, share results. So we've got a lot of planned uses here today, it looks like. That is the speed that we are going to ask you to react to these polling questions. So thank you very much for that. And now what I would like to do is hand it over to Helen Berry with DNR. She's going to give you an overview of where we're headed with the indicator, and then we're off to the races today.
Okay, next slide, please. Hi, everyone. I'm Helen Berry. I'm an ecologist at DNR, and we wanted to start by briefly remembering why we're here. So as we know, kelp is a pillar of our ecosystem, and it's hard, there's so much to say about it, but we can summarize its role in 2 huge buckets. It provides habitat, which is a place to live, and primary production, which fuels the food web. And in these ways, kelp connects many organisms, including forage fish, which are shown in this beautiful picture by Florian Grainer. Next slide. Salmon, who use kelp as migration corridors, refugia, and hunting grounds. Next slide. Orcas, next slide, and rockfish. And so kelp provides the connection to all of these different components that are valuable to us. Next slide. Kelp's also a cultural pillar. It was a migration corridor for early people. It's a place to fish, shown in these maps by Samish fishermen. It's a food source, and it's an integral component of our stories and our art. Next slide. So the Floating Kelp Canopy Indicator Project, which we're talking about here today, is split into 3 phases, and I'll give you a really brief summary of the phases. It began in January of this year when we did initial scoping and identified requirements. And many of you came to the workshop and provided comments on the report. So thanks for that. We're in phase 2 now, which is exploring indicator options. And in some ways, this is the most fun stage because we're at the 60% design stage. So it's sufficiently developed for you all to see where we're going and to help us determine where it goes from here. So today we're going to introduce you to the prototype indicator, and we want to hear your initial impressions and your questions. There's a 200-page report, which I suspect most people haven't read yet, which is totally fine. I'm putting the link in the chat. Comments on this phase and the report are due August 1st. So today is just to introduce you, and you can contact us at any point to discuss this more in a smaller group. So just let us know. In phase 3, which is the next phase, we'll refine and finalize the indicator. And we're hoping that you're going to check back for that phase first in December for the report, and then for the final workshop in January. And now I'll pass it on to Tom, who's going to talk about GIFs and bling.
Hi, everybody. Tom Mumford here. Hopefully you can all hear and or see me this morning. Yes.
Oh, next slide, please.
Yes, no? Am I alive?
We hear you, Tom. You're great.
All right. That's good. I don't see my window popping up here. Anyway, just to make sure that everybody is here today and paying attention. And we did this last time around. It was kind of fun, a little enticement here. So basically, all you folks have an opportunity to win a prize. And what I've done, I've put all your names in this kelp basket, little slips of paper. I will draw them out at the end. You have to be present to win at the end. And the present, the prize, are 2 bags of these sea shrooms, which come from Joth Davis at the Blue Dot Sea Farms. It's the only kelp farm we've got in the state of Washington right now. And they're making these, and actually you can probably get any bar on Bainbridge Dry Island right now. You can find some of these. So that's the prize. So be here and stick around and be a winner. So at this point, let's pass this over to the discussion about the proposed indicator, and just an overview by Danielle and Wendell and Nicole. So we'll take it from there.
Next slide. Next slide.
All right, sorry. So the indicator that we're proposing today is part of the Puget Sound Partnership's Beaches and Marine Vegetation Vital Sign. And this vital sign keeps the pulse on the aerial extent of floating kelp canopies in Washington state, with an eye towards understanding the status, trends, and drivers of kelp abundance. Next slide. The Puget Sound Vital Signs Project was introduced in 2011 and revised in 2020. Its primary goals are to improve communication, assist planning, inform the legislature, conduct rigorous science, and develop a reference point for changes within the sound. And the purpose of this program is to inspire focused action by developing products that are scientifically sound, pertinent to regional ecosystem goals, and that are reliable and practical to measure. Next slide, please. So far, we've been working hard to meet these goals, and we've received a lot of valuable feedback from the broader community about how to make this the most useful tool possible. Some key considerations that we've received feedback on are for this product to be available to diverse audiences, to balance simplicity with options for detail, to look at multiple time scales, or multiple time spans and multiple spatial scales, including the open coast, to maximize the use of available data, which comes in many different forms, incorporate alternative data sets and ways of knowing that may not be traditionally included in quantitative scientific assessments, to link ecosystem stressors and management, and to develop a strategic plan for the future. Next slide, please. The development of the floating kelp vital sign is also happening in tandem with our ongoing monitoring efforts and collaborations. We currently monitor floating kelp canopies using kayak surveys, small boat surveys, drone imagery, as well as aerial imagery from fixed-wing aircraft. We're keen to continue to develop monitoring methods and to take advantage of newly developing technologies. This summer, we're planning a broad survey of floating kelp canopies using fixed-wing aircraft and 4-band aerial imagery across the state. And so we're working to incorporate as much current, historical, and new data as we can in this product as we move forward. Next slide, please. Overall, the indicator development can only happen with the support of multiple data sources and collaboration with many audiences to create a product that is well-informed, scientifically rigorous, and useful for all different types of people and organizations. Next slide, please.
All right, you all, I have lots of things happening outside of my window. Can you hear them or do you just hear me?
Mostly you.
Okay, great. Just wanted to double check on that. Let me know if that changes and I can close the window. So developing a floating kelp canopy area indicator for the Puget Sound vital signs really represents the latest opportunity for us to build momentum and support for the broader goals envisioned in the Kelp Conservation and Recovery Plan. So central to that vision is meaningful community engagement. And we know from recent analyses that broad engagement, not scientific publications, are more likely to result in positive conservation outcomes. Next slide, please. And our approach to community engagement extends from indicator development and out to the broader Kelp plan, and it rests on 3 core principles or values. The first is intentional outreach, the second is diverse participation, and the third is co-production of knowledge. And so our goal is that intentional outreach results in diverse participation that allows for the co-production of knowledge, such that the indicator really synthesizes data from different sources of state agencies, community and citizen science, indigenous science, and other sources. A wonderful example of the possibilities of this approach is the Samish Indian Nations Kelp Monitoring Program, which Helen alluded to earlier. Next slide, please. So we do recognize, however, that various project constraints really limit our ability to fully realize true transdisciplinary integrated co-creation of knowledge. Next slide, please. Our indicator development has to fit within existing Puget Sound vital sign framework requirements, which means that the first step in this process, co-design, is already kind of off the table. And a 2-year project timeline also limits our ability to move at the speed of trust and relationship building between diverse participants. Next slide, please. But we can strive for co-production by synthesizing different sources of data and information and collectively determining the relevant scope, spatial scale, and time scale, which is what we will endeavor to do today at the workshop. And we can also, next slide, lay the groundwork for the next iteration of this co-creation of knowledge cycle within the broader context of the Kelp plan, so that it does include both co-design and co-production and starts to move us closer to our ultimate vision and values. Next slide, please. So community engagement in this project can take many forms. There's direct engagement in the indicator development project, which is sort of the top part of this pyramid here and the narrowest. So it's more narrowly defined to ensure that we're consistent with the Puget Sound Partnership Vital Signs Framework. And we welcome contributions like data sets and encourage collaborations with other scientists and among different researchers. We also welcome contributions that could inform related monitoring and conservation efforts and connect to the broader Kelp plan. So those are both broader in scope. Next slide, please. So we have another poll question for you all. Our long-term goal is to meaningfully engage with diverse communities and link to other kelp science and management. Are we approaching this goal in the right way?
Lucia, while we're doing that, let's go next slide to see if we can get this visual resolved. Perfect. Okay, a couple more seconds, get just your initial gut reaction in. Perfect.
And while
Okay.
Elizabeth tallies that poll, I'd like to add that we will be asking you all these questions again at the end of this presentation, right when we wrap up at noon. And so you'll have a chance to change your vote.
Great. So, hi everyone. I'm Wendell Raymond at University of Washington, and I'm gonna be the first to introduce you to our proposed blended indicator. So, in an effort to combine the feedback that we received from phase 1 of this project, the Puget Sound Partnership requirements and goals for vital signs and indicators, and incorporate as much data as possible and different ways of knowing and engaging the community, what we're going to go walk through today is what we call our proposed blended indicator. And so this blended indicator combines and visualizes multiple different data sources on floating kelp from around the state. And we present it in a hierarchical structure in order to balance key results that are simple and easy to understand, but also provide nuance and detail at other levels for those who are interested. Next slide. So the floating kelp canopy area indicator in our current proposal is split into 2 main parts. There's visual summary products and technical products. So the visual summary products, our goal is to be accessible to diverse audiences and present it in a hierarchical structure so that the bottom line, easy take-homes can be really clear and present, but also provide more detailed analyses and plots and information for those that are interested. The other big part are the technical products. This is where we use as much data as possible and combine multiple data sources, and we detail how we do that. This is captured in a couple PDF documents that we envision will be a part of the final indicator. So next slide. So what we're going to spend a lot of time doing today is walking through the visual summary products. And they're set up in this 3-tiered hierarchical structure. So at the top is the info map, in the middle is sub-basin summary pages, and then down at the bottom is sub-basin reports. So the info map doesn't have a lot of detail, but it shows big picture trends across the state and within different regions of the state. Moving down, sub-basin summary pages have a little more detail about a specific area, and then sub-basin reports have a lot of detail about that specific area presented in almost a scientific paper type format. Next slide. So to start to look at these products visually, here is our mock-up of the info map, and this would be the first thing that you would see when you search for the indicator on Puget Sound Info or on our hub website. Then if you wanted some more information, you could click on one of these icons or sub-basins. Next slide. And that would bring you to a sub-basin summary page. So here, there'd be some more maps, some bulleted key points, some graphs, and a description of the data sets that were used in that sub-basin, and a little more detail on the trend and status classification that we gave. Then from there, if you want some more information, some more detail, next slide, that would bring you to the sub-basin summary report for that sub-basin. And as I mentioned, this would be a PDF. We envision this being a PDF document structured very similarly to a technical report or scientific paper that would really dig into the details of the data, the patterns, trends, analyses, and the rationale and justification for why a certain trend designation was given. And so in the report that we released, examples of these visuals are in appendices 1 through 6. So you can take a closer look at those when you have time. Next slide. So I have our next question for you. How well does the linked set of communication products meet our goal to deliver a basic summary and additional detail? So we're just looking for your gut reaction right now, and we're going to get more into the details of this later. If you have any quick comments or questions, you're free to put a few words in the chat.
Okay, a few more folks need to respond and then. Okay. Okay, next slide. All right, we are now going to move into a discussion around the different components that go into this indicator. And I'm going to hand it to Nicole Nahr, who is going to introduce what we are calling a fishbowl discussion to talk about the process. And we will be highlighting Danielle, Wendell, and Helen as our panelists. Next slide.
All right, everyone. Again, I'm Nicole Nahr with Washington Sea Grant. And so we decided to do this fishbowl discussion instead of giving you all this information as a formal presentation. So in the spirit of co-creation of knowledge and in acknowledgement of the fact that this product is still very much a work in progress, the fishbowl really helps us, I think, diminish the authority of scientists in a couple ways that might be useful. So first, it should feel a bit more conversational than a straight up presentation. And second, the question should give us all a chance to look under the metaphorical hood. What were the key decision points? What were the trade-offs involved? How did our science team reconcile trade-offs in order to get to the info map that you all see here today? And what other alternatives did they consider or are they considering? So this is really our way of inviting all of you into this continuing conversation. Wendell, Danielle, and Helen will be the fish inside of the fishbowl. I will be the MC or the person feeding the fish so that they say interesting things. And the rest of you are the fish outside watching it all unfold. So be sure to jot down any questions or comments that come up during the fishbowl conversation because you'll have a chance to bring those up in the subsequent breakout group discussions. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So this info map looks like it contains a whole lot of content and took a lot of thought and deliberation to create. Let's unpack some of the thinking that went into the process so that the rest of us understand the context a bit better. First, let us dig into the geographic assessment areas, which to me sounds like it's helping orient our thinking about space as it relates to kelp. So how did you all decide on the geographic scope or which areas to include in the info map and why?
So next slide, please. Geographic assessment areas are just simply a term used by the partnership to describe what areas you're making conclusions over. And our starting point was the partnership's study area, which is Puget Sound out to Cape Flattery. And you'll notice a very fundamental decision that we made that's different about this map is that we decided to add the outer coast. And for me personally, as an ecologist, it's essential to consider the outer coast from an ecological perspective, because that environment is more comparable to other regions with kelp, like Oregon and California. And conditions are really different on the open coast compared to within the Salish Sea, which is an estuarine fjord, just a really different environment. So in addition to my ecological considerations, we got a lot of feedback from other people that it's important to include the open coast for both cultural and management reasons. So it felt to us at this point that it would be a big mistake to exclude the open coast, but it's one of the things that we're hoping to get more feedback on. Back
Great.
to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Helen. So once you all figured out the scope, how did you decide the best way to divide up the region into subbasins? And how did you settle on the most appropriate boundaries between each geographic unit?
Yeah, so next slide. So we knew that we needed to divide up the area because we know that Puget Sound is a really diverse place. And the most common approach that is ecologically meaningful is to use subbasins that are defined by physical oceanography. And so our starting point for this was the Pisner subbasins, which are shown on the left of the slide. But we modified them a bit based on added additional considerations for floating kelp and management. So for example, we split the Strait of Juan de Fuca subbasin into an eastern and western strait to acknowledge sort of the well-described environmental gradient as you go east to west, west to east in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The rockfish recovery plan and the kelp conservation and recovery plan also only go as far as Eastern Strait, so we wanted to expand that. It also seemed important to keep the total number of subbasins reasonably small enough to keep track of, and so we feel that this current proposal balances that with 10 total subbasins. And I'll also note that in the pages in the report listed here, we detail some more decision areas of where we drew boundaries and some possible alternatives.
Great, thanks for that context. So these subbasins to me still look pretty large. Did you all think about and include smaller scales, and how did you decide what those scales should be?
Yes, we did. Next slide, please. So we developed a hierarchical view of space for this geographic approach. We start with the subbasin, which is on the scale of 100 to 1,000 kilometers. Then we go down to the reach, which is 10 to 100 kilometers, followed by zone at 1 to 10 kilometers, and finally site, which can be 1 kilometer or a custom small area that's being studied. And we think that this is important because there's a lot of variability in kelp dynamics and stressors and other things within the environment at these different scales that can drive kelp abundance and health over time. So if you can go to the next slide, please. I'll show you an example here. So in the Eastern Strait, you can see the top image here shows the Eastern Strait divided into reaches. So each color is a different reach. And these reaches are similar to the subbasins in that they're divided by physical oceanography, just at a finer scale. And so we further divide those reaches into zones, which allow us to look at the local scale. And so when you first look at this, at the reach scale, all of these areas right now are currently doing fine. They're either stable or slightly increasing over time. However, if you zoom in past the reach level to the zone level, can you please go to the next slide? We see some really important variability that will drive management at a local scale potentially. And so here you can see in this figure, the gray areas are where we have observed kelp within the last 33 years. And then the colored areas are where kelp has been observed within the last 5 years. So these gray areas represent places where kelp has been recently, but not very recently, so not in the last 5 years. And so you can see here there's a really strong spatial gradient where in the edges of the reach, their kelp is either doing well or maybe contracting a bit, but in the middle of the reach in these several zones near Protection Island, kelp is all but gone. And so this is important for our understanding of what's going on in these locations.
Could you unpack the why a little bit more? So what do each of these scales imply in terms of management or action?
Yeah, so in this example, the total kelp cover within the reach is stable, but we see these really severe focal losses. And these could be due to environmental drivers, human stressors, and it gives us the ability to drill into that and to try to understand what's driving kelp abundance over time. And so by looking at this, it may initiate local action to evaluate those stressors, or it may motivate additional local monitoring in order to document changes that are happening at this really fine scale. And we think that nesting our consideration of spatial scales allows us to target the most useful information to the managers who need it. So from a really local scale up to a statewide scale, we step through how we understand kelp is doing in these different locations. Next slide. So we've told you a bit about these geographic assessment areas, gut reaction. How do you feel about the 10 subbasins with the ability to draw down to smaller units? Does this proposal meet our ecological, cultural, and management goals? And if you have any additional comments, please put them in the chat and we will return to them in a bit.
Okay, so now let's talk about these color-coded categories. Why did you all pick these categories, and what does each category and color mean? And I think we want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, I'll take that. This is Helen. We picked categories that we hope will provide a very clear bottom line message to people and to a broad audience, not just to a scientist. And then we paired the categories, the different categories, with stoplight colors to underscore the message. And by the way, we're still hotly debating these categories, so we're really interested to hear from all of you. But in a nutshell, increasing or stable is green, which means don't worry about it. Concern is yellow, which means there are some issues we need to think about. And decline is red, which communicates this is a big problem. We also chose gray to identify areas with insufficient data, because it's important to be able to say, I don't know. And then last, we might need a category for areas where floating kelp has never occurred. It depends on where we put subbasin boundaries, but that may be true for portions of Hood Canal. And so blue is, we've never had any canopies present there.
Okay, so how do these categories and classifications work in practice? Can you show us some examples?
Yeah, I can walk through some. Next slide. So starting with some of the more straightforward ones, we've defined increasing as a statistically significant increase or a clear pattern of increase over time in summary statistics or plots. So again, this graph here, it's pretty clear that over the time period that's shown, there's a increasing trend. Next slide. So next category, stable or no trend. We define this as a non-significant trend test or pattern without a strong slope over the time period of interest in the summary statistics. So again, in this plot, I'm looking at the time period shown. There is some year-to-year variability, but on average, it's pretty close to the mean plotted in the black line. Next slide. So next is declining. So we define this as a significant trend test or a clear pattern of loss over the time period of interest in the summary statistics. So in these four plots here, there was some amount of kelp early in the time series. But more recently, the amount of kelp has decreased substantially, and in some of these cases has completely disappeared.
Okay, so is the relevant time scale or the scale of interest that we're thinking about, is it the same for each of the geographic assessment areas?
No, it's actually quite a bit different, and it's based on the available data in the subbasin. And so, as a quick example, the longest annual data stream that we're working with is 32 years. But we also have historical ecological data from some regions like South Puget Sound that are 145 years long. So we can look back at least to one time point way in the past. But looking across all the subbasins, many subbasins have less than 10 years of data, which limits the temporal, the timescales that we can think about.
So how do you decide whether the limitations of the amount of data or the degree of uncertainty warrant something being classified as concern versus insufficient data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll take that one. Next slide, please. So for concern, we have patterns in the data that suggest potential losses, but there are some sort of uncertainties that preclude definitive classification, either due to uncertainties within the data or subtle patterns. So this category really identifies a need for further research or monitoring. And here's an example right here. What looks like a very clear decline in this location is actually a little bit less clear when you dig into the data. So the two later time points with the stars in them were conducted with slightly different survey methods than the first bar. And there's this gap between the first time point that was looked at and the latter two time points. And so in this location, we need more data in order to understand whether this is a decline that will continue or that it's related to survey methods or short-term declines that are happening in an area. Next slide, please. Whereas insufficient data is really just, we don't have the data yet. So the data lacks sufficient spatial or temporal coverage, or the uncertainties in the data limit its use for assessment of changes over time. So for example, in our subbasin Saratoga-Whidbey, there are 4 MRC kayak sites, which tell us about what's happening at a few locations, but these cover less than 10% of the shoreline. And we don't have any other data sources for the subbasin yet. And so we're working on improving those data sources, but at the current time, the quantitative data doesn't allow us to make assessment of the trends that are happening using statistical testing. Next slide, please. And then finally, the last one, going back to an easy one, this is saying that there are no kelp beds present or documented. And as Helen mentioned, this likely applies to Hood Canal, depending on exactly where you draw the lines for the subbasin, and is something that we'll continue to check up on, but may indicate that these areas don't need to be considered as strongly when we're looking at kelp trends within the sound. Next slide, please.
So before we get to that question, I just wanted to ask, who do you envision these categories as being for?
Yeah, so we envision these categories are for everyone. The goal is to make them broadly accessible to folks, as well as allow you to dig into the science further in areas which may have concern or that you want to know more about specifically. Go ahead and answer this question, and then if you have any thoughts, please feel free to put them in the chat or jot them down for our discussion later on in the breakout groups.
Okay, I'm going to give everyone another 5 seconds to respond.
Okay, next slide, please. So there's not necessarily just one color in each of these graphics. Can we discuss the shapes and symbols layered within each one? What do each of these levels represent?
Yeah, so let's go to the next slide. So the symbols and shapes actually represent two things. So the inner cross and diamond show just quantitative results split into two different time periods. And the outer circle is the overall assessment, or just the bottom line for the subbasin. So, and we can kind of walk through this with an example from the Eastern Strait. Next slide. So looking in the graph in the upper right-hand corner, in the last 5 years, we've measured big increases in canopy area, which may be related to recovery from the marine heat wave in 2014, 2015. However, the entire data record going back 32 years shows really high variability and perhaps a slight increase over time. But that's just the last 32, 33 years, which isn't a really long time from an ecologically perspective, especially for a species that has quite a bit of year-to-year variability. So we can look at, consider other types of data that we have. And in this example, we have maps from fertilizer surveys in 1911, shown in the lower right, that suggest stability, but also some losses in the far eastern portion of this subbasin.
Okay, wait. So there are 3 categories. 2 of them are based on quantitative data. Why did you separate the quantitative data from other types of information like the rig map?
So this is something we've been thinking a lot about, and I'm sure we're going to continue to think a lot about. We separated out quantitative data from other sources of knowledge because the Vital Signs program has strong goals for rigorous science. And our society also assesses those information types differently. So that's one answer. The other answer is if we separate out the quantitative data from other sources of knowing, we can see where the data gaps are clear. So perhaps go to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. Let's stop there. So to stop there, you could see when you look at the info map that a lot of the regions are gray in the middle. All of those regions that are gray in the middle, so the San Juans, North Puget Sound, Saratoga, Whidbey, Central Puget Sound, and Hood Canal, all have serious, serious data gaps. And those are places where we either think they're healthy or we have concerns about them. But you can look at that inner portion to tell the difference. So that's the short answer. And the icon, so the icon's basically trying to give us all some insight into where the scientific data gaps are.
Okay, that makes sense. So how did you bring together the quantitative data and the other forms of information like indigenous scientific knowledge and traditional and local knowledge? Were there any instances where different information sources showed conflicting trends?
Basically what we did, and this is really hard, and there isn't a clear series of protocols that are well developed to do this. But so what we did was we integrated the key messages and intent from each of the different data sources, and then we put them together and drew overall conclusions. And this is kind of in the spirit of braiding different forms of knowledge. So specifically, we'd ask each data set, what's the spatial extent, what's the time period, and then what might be the uncertainty related. So the surprise for us, and it's good news, is that in most cases, the different types of knowledges supported each other. So for instance, in San Juan's, our scientific data is really limited. That's why it's gray in the center. but we have indigenous scientific knowledge from Samish fishermen that suggests there have been losses. We also have a handful of scientific studies and other observations which also suggest losses. And so in that area, it was really easy to conclude that we have concerns for the San Juans, although we can't draw strong conclusions from the long-term monitoring data alone. And it looks like we're ready to get everyone's initial impressions of what they've heard with a quick poll. So how well do our proposed time periods and division of information types address the information needs of scientists, managers, and communities? And remember, you can give us a gut reaction. We're not going to force you to stick with whatever you say, and you can always say, I don't know yet either. One of the fundamental questions for us here is just how much do we as a community want to distinguish between or group together scientific data with other types of knowledge, which is a pretty fundamental question.
All right, next slide, please. So the report mentions that there is a remix or an alternative version of the info map that has just 2 levels instead of the 3-level version that we've all just worked through. What's the difference between these 2 versions?
So here are the 2 versions. And this goes back into how you braid together scientific knowledge with other sources of knowledge. The 3-level icon that we've been talking about is on the left, and the 2-level alternatives on the right. They're really similar. The key difference is that the 3-level version separates out the quantitative assessment. That's the inner cross and the diamond shown in purple here. In contrast, the 2-level map doesn't distinguish between types of knowledge. It just integrates all of our knowledge into a recent, which is the cross, and the entire data record, which is the circle. So you'll notice the 2 maps, the overall conclusion of the 2 maps is the same. So you can look at the outer circle. It's the same color in both maps. And both of those use the same data. So they're drawn from the same really detailed subbasin reports. And so the question just really is, how do we want to slice and dice the information, and what's the best way to deliver it to people?
So why did you decide to consider this 2-level version?
Yeah, so the goal is for the info map to be intuitive, and a simpler map may be more intuitive, but it also loses a bit of information that we're trying to communicate. And so what are we willing to give up in order to simplify and make things more straightforward for folks?
Okay, so what do you think is lost really by going from the 3 to the 2-level versions? Like, what do you think are the disadvantages of this 2-level version?
Yeah, so the most prominent disadvantage is the separation of quantitative data that reflect traditional scientific rigor, which is a priority for Puget Sound Partnership, and separating that from other data sources and other ways of knowing, whether that's indigenous scientific knowledge or a one-off paper about one site somewhere in the San Juans or within the subbasin, from 30 years ago. And so from one perspective, it can be handy to see the different story that these 2 types of data tell and see how they work together.
Okay, so flip side, what do you think is gained from going from 3 down to 2 levels? What are the advantages of the 2-level version?
Well, in the 2-level version, it's more straightforward. There's less layers of information to decipher, and it presents the data in an overall synthesized way of all the information we have right off the bat at the 2 timestamps. So we will continue a lot of this discussion, I'm betting, in the breakout groups. But next slide. Right now, we'd like to get just your initial gut reaction impressions on which version do you like more, the 3-level, the 2-level, or you don't know yet. And again, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to put some in the chat. And we know that you may have a lot of questions about all the details at this point, which is great, but we want that initial feeling.
Okay, 5 more seconds. Okay. Okay, next slide, I believe. So that actually wraps up our presentation. Thank you very much to our panelists, Wendell, Danielle, Helen, and Nicole for some excellent facilitation. We are actually ahead of schedule, which is excellent because this means we will have a few extra minutes for discussion in our breakout groups. So just to give you a little bit of a lay of the land of where we're headed, we are going to take about a 10-minute break. And when you get back from break, you will have the option of joining a breakout room. You might just end up there. You might have to click a button on your screen. We have Lucia right now as tech support. So you can contact her in the chat. Here's how this is going to go. We're going to have about 35 minutes in these breakout groups. Each group has 2 project team members who will be helping facilitate the discussion, as well as address those questions that we have around some of the decisions that have been made so far or the considerations that have been taken. And we will also have a note taker. So the goal really is to hear from you all. What are those outstanding questions or concerns that you have? And what are your thoughts on these various aspects that we've been discussing? So we're going to be capturing all of those questions and comments and including it in our comment summary for further consideration. And we do really want it to be an open dialogue. So just a couple of maybe meeting discussion expectations. We hope that everyone does fully participate as they are comfortable. We do hope that people are feeling open and honest with their feedback so that we can take it into consideration. And we do recognize that there are probably going to be a lot of different ideas, maybe even some competing ideas. And as we found on the project team, a lot of emotion behind some of these things. So we welcome all of that into the room, and we just want to make sure that everyone's feeling safe and respected in sharing those ideas. After we have that discussion, we're then going to come back as a full group. Our note takers are going to share just a few key high-level takeaways from those breakout discussions. And then we're going to give you an opportunity to re-evaluate some of those gut reactions in a poll. We're going to ask you the same questions again. So if there's anything you need more information on in order to answer those, feel free to ask those questions in your breakout groups. And then we'll have next steps. So we are at 10:55 right now. Let's reconvene and start our breakout groups at 11:05. And if you have any questions or concerns during the break, feel free to reach out to Lucia or myself in the chat and we can help you address those. But yeah, grab some water, grab some coffee, meet us back here in 10 minutes at 11:05 and we'll move into our breakout groups. Excellent, thank you. Okay, welcome back everyone. I hope you all had fruitful conversations in your breakout groups. What we are going to do quickly is hear from our note takers, just a couple of high-level takeaways, and I'm going to call on those. And so we just want to share out really where was the momentum in your conversations and any key takeaways that you think would be great to share with the larger audience. So let's go ahead and start with room 2, which was Helen, Jeff, and Melissa's. And I believe, Melissa, you were our note taker.
Yes. So couple of the key takeaways for our group were, to begin with, the preference of a 2 over the 3-level symbol, and also having a symbol that shows whether we have any serious data gaps. The group was also open to having a 1-level symbol or coloring the whole basin instead of having a circle and then using something like hash marks to further include other information. And then another key takeaway was the concern over the names of the categories. For example, insufficient data and stable were some of the problematic categories that we talked about. Just because like we don't know what exactly those categories are conveying, like just for like the general public. Those are like the two main takeaways that we were focusing on.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Okay, let's go to group 3, which was Danielle, Todd, and Dana. And I believe, Dana, you were our note taker.
All right, so we had kind of similar discussion. We spent a lot of time discussing kind of the communication and audience a bit, and both looking at how to consider the images, and this, it kind of included both the 2 versus 3 level as well as the geographic subbasins. So both from a geographic perspective, how can we kind of make sure that we're communicating clearly to managers and planners that might use this, and including that kind of jurisdictional key communications, key takeaways on areas of importance for kelp loss or protection, but also really keeping in mind the story that it is we're trying to tell with this graphic. And that gets more to the 2 versus 3 level, with the sense that is the need for more data, which is kind of more clearly communicated in the 3 level, the main story we want to tell, or is it kind of those areas of concern with that's a bit more, the group felt more strongly communicated in the 2 level, and really just emphasizing a lot of how we want to make sure we're really telling this story clearly and making it accessible to everyone, and language that's used and not always so kind of data heavy and intimidating some folks. And I will stop there. I'd say others in my group put things in the chat that I might have missed.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, moving on to group 4, which was Megan, Bart, and Suzanne. And I believe, Suzanne, you were our note taker.
Yes, we took copious notes, but in summary, I would say that our question 1 was about the borders was pretty well supported, with the exception of whether or not they are, the subbasins are, how do they represent culturally information? For management and ecological decisions, it's good, but it was unclear about cultural implications. The colors are good, only the greens are a little too close in shading. And then I think we spoke a lot about when we look at a subbasin and say that we have concern, but then we have insufficient data, and that detracts from the confidence. And that is all a part of this discussion about the multiple symbology. And so the simpler it is, the much more effective your communication is going to be. So I think most people voted for more simplistic, although everyone understood the complexity in what it is you're trying to convey at the same time. And yeah, that's in brief.
Perfect. Thank you. We will go to the next group, which is Pete and Casey and Lisa. And I believe, Lisa, you are our note taker.
Yeah, so we had a couple like county level people in our group, and one of the first things that we honed in on was that it's important that the data contributors at like a smaller scale than the sub-basin see themselves represented in the geographic assessment areas. And then we also talked about inconsistencies across the basins with respect to baseline. So just questions about like, what is that relative to? And is it a moving baseline? And then it gets into that whole thing. It's like stable is tricky. And then the third thing we talked about was the info map, and it was kind of like a kind of going back and forth between the 2 and the 3-star, but that we, for simplicity, would perhaps think that the 2-star map was more effective because perhaps we don't have enough information to we don't have, it's unclear that we have the level of data to communicate clearly what's going on with the 3-star maps.
Thank you. Okay, group 6, which was Tom and Tyler and Nicole. And I believe, Nicole, you were our note taker.
Yes, so our group started with sort of a conversation about who is the main audience for our communication products like the info map, and whether we were trying to do something like universal versus something targeted and sort of the pros and cons of our tiered approach. I think there was general support for the inclusion of the outer coast. We also spent quite a bit of time discussing data accessibility. We had a lot of scientists in our group. They really liked the idea of being able to dig into the data in more detail for specific purposes, maybe like grant proposals or designing specific restoration projects or doing some additional research. Sort of the more interactive the data that's accessible is, the better, but access seemed to be the priority when possible. And there was a request to include contact information from the groups that provided data so that folks could follow up with them on those. We tossed around a few ideas for different names for the geographic levels, since the names as is might not necessarily convey like the hierarchy of size. And then we spent a bit of time talking about the info map, the 2 versus 3 level versions. There was some suggestions for maybe thinking through the symbols a little differently for the 2 versions. So maybe concentric circles was hard to see right away. But I think among this group, sort of more information was viewed as a good thing rather than less when deciding between the 2 and the 3 levels.
Great, thank you. And I was the note taker for group 1, so I will be quite concise for sake of time. We also had a similar conversation about really thinking about who our audience and stakeholders are and making sure that we're appropriately communicating to them, thinking about how we do that visually with the symbols. Are we sending unintended communication out with certain symbols? So how do we make sure that it's simple, but that we are also maybe driving or forcing the user to actually access the detailed information? So thinking about who are those audiences, legislature versus the public versus a scientist. How do we make sure that we can give the critical information at a high level, but not so high level that they're missing the necessary decision-making data? And then talking through the different levels. And so really the pros and cons of what those levels are. And I think we were able to identify advantages and disadvantages to both. Okay, so I am now going to move us into our last activity before wrap up. I am launching the last polling questions. These are all the questions that you've seen before. So please feel free to scroll through all 6 questions. Have your responses changed at all after your breakout group discussions? So again, please feel free to jump into that and start answering them. And is it working? Because I'm seeing 0 participants. Can someone from the project team confirm they see it?
I can see
It's
it.
working.
Great. We're just very thoughtful.
It's wanting all 6 answers at once, so that takes some time to go through it.
Yes. So hopefully the questions are the same. You just gauge if your response might be different now. And Lucia, can you go to the next slide? And then maybe the next one. Perfect.
Elizabeth, I just submitted mine. I don't know if you're starting to see them show up or not.
They are trickling in. Yep, thank you. All right, we are almost there. So just a couple more seconds and then I will share. I'll keep that up so that you can all scroll as we wrap up and see how those responses have maybe changed. Okay, looks like we are slowing down, so I will share those results. Feel free to look at them. We are going to keep these so that we have them as a reference point. And I'm going to hand it over now to Tom Mumford to discuss next steps and our long-awaited raffle.
All right. I'm sitting here watching the screen with great interest. So first of all, let's do a raffle. I mean, let's have fun here. before we do the final wrap. So I have here in front of me a kelp basket made by my wife, and inside the kelp basket are all these little pieces of paper. And I've included employees too. Normally, some of these things, you have employees are excluded from raffles and so forth. Not the case here. And there's probably going to be several dry runs because I've got probably twice as many people on this thing as there are actually showing up today. So here we go. Eeny, meeny, miny. Okay. I drew out Betsy Carlson. Is Betsy here? Do I hear one? Do I hear two? No Betsy? Okay. Betsy's by the wayside. Draw number 2. Coming up. Mike Doherty. Oh my goodness. This isn't going well, guys.
Well, we
Mike?
had a bit of attrition from the registration list, so we might have to grab
Yeah, I
someone.
know. Okay, that's we're there. Let's see here. Keep going. We'll get there after a while. Allie Simpson. Allie.
I'm here. Yay.
Why, okay. Hey, your odds are getting, everybody's odds are getting better now, right? Okay. Carolyn Kitchell. This isn't going well at all, guys. All right. Let's keep going here. We got to have one in here somewhere. Michael Collins. Mr. Kelp guy, Mr. Kelp farmer. Michael. All right. Betty Bookheim. I haven't seen Betty either.
Oh, I'm here. I'm here.
Here.
All right. Step right up, Betty.
I want the basket that you're drawing those from.
Well, that one, you have to negotiate with Nancy about that one. All right, Betty, you're here in town, so I'm not gonna have to mail these to you, okay? You are the proud winner of 2 bags of these sea shrooms, right? Which you can also, I'm not quite sure how you get them retail right now. If you want to find out more about this, get a hold of the Blue Dot Sea Farm folks, Joth Davis and so forth. Betty will do this. All right, so just to wrap up here, you all can see the screen. The "we are here" arrow just moved downwards just a smidge, right? We're at the end of workshop 2. So as Helen said, we're still taking comments until the 1st of August. And I think in the meantime, this is really important, that this conversation is not over. This was just kind of almost a warm up. And if people want to have more questions, if they want to meet as groups, if they want to have one-on-one with various people, get a hold of us. Don't be bashful. This is the conversation is really important here. So we'll continue until the 1st of August for comments due, and then we'll turn around and put all these together and start to work on all the things we've heard today and what we'll hear between now and the 1st of August. And the end of August, we'll turn those comments loose and then start on the starting to finalize this indicator here. So
question.
Yeah. Yes.
Is there a place we can access the slides that were presented today?
Elizabeth?
Well, we will have the recording. And Helen, I'm not sure if we had intended to put the slides just themselves anywhere.
Sure, we'll post the slides. So
Yeah.
we will post a full recording of the meeting and the slides along with the incredibly long report. And please, everyone, if you want to have a smaller meeting to discuss any of this in detail, give us a shout. We're talking about this a lot. We got a lot of good advice. And so we're going to be working on this. And we know
Okay.
we've given you a lot of information over a very short time period.
Yeah.
And posted where?
Posted on the Kelp Hub site, which is in the emails that you were sent when you registered to this.
Okay.
Who's saying this? Because I can send you another
Jeff.
link.
Yeah, Jeff.
Oh, yeah.
Howard.
Jeff Howard.
Yeah, I'll look at my email.
Cool. And Jeff, I'll send you, we have your email now. We'll send you an updated email with a link.
Okay.
All right. So Elizabeth, any final words here?
None from me. Helen, anything from you?
I think we should let everyone go. Thank you so much. We so appreciate it. let us know if you have any other thoughts, and we'll be back at this in December. So you could join us
All right.
again and see where we've ended up.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Everybody.
Bye,
Thank you all.
everyone.
Goodbye.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, Elizabeth, can you tell me how to find where this chat is saved? I saved the chat, but I can't find it.